Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Love Your Whistleblowers, It Can Save Your Company Millions. A few reminders before we begin. We want this to be an interactive session, so if you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them using your GoToWebinar console. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions. If we do not get to all of the questions, we will respond to you individually via email. As a reminder, the session is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent shortly after the broadcast. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sara Habberstad. With more than 20 years of contract and legal experience in international enterprises, Sara is a formidable attorney contributing an impressive track record of legal, risk management, and compliance expertise. Sara serves as the General Counsel for Questback, where she leads the legal compliance and risk management functions for Questback's operations spanning 19 different countries. Her passions for equality, transparency, accountability, and compliance are second to none, and she regularly contributes thought-leading pieces on executive leadership and enterprise operations, focused on governance, compliance, stakeholder relationships, and risk management. Prior to Questback, Sara held legal counsel positions at some of the world's largest international companies, including senior legal counsel at Siemens and contracts director at SAS Institute. Sara is an alumnus of the University of Oslo. Sara, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Rosalind. Thank you for having me.
We have a very exciting topic today, whistleblowers, which has been in the media and headlines with movements like Me Too, where people are having a stronger voice and coming forward, and also high-profile scandals like Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, where employees are coming forward. There is a transition shift in today's society where people are coming forward and speaking out against corporate wrongdoings, among other illegalities. So that will be our topic today, and we definitely look forward to your insights and expertise, Sara. And what you can tell us from a business point of view, how should organizations manage whistleblowers, and how do they redefine that relationship? And with that, I will jump into our first question for you. From your unique perspective as a corporate attorney and as a female executive, what is whistleblowing and where is its place in society today?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think people think of whistleblowing as very many different things. Perhaps today in particular, with the cases that we have seen, as you say, with Cambridge Analytica, with Me Too, previously with Snowden, and so on, the cases that we often see in the media, they have exploded into being exactly that, media cases. And what we want to talk about today really is what whistleblowing is for an employer. Because naturally, most companies want to act ethically and to avoid these kind of behaviors that lead to scandals and that lead to non-compliance and again lead to employees going out publicly. An employer wants to get this information at an early stage so that they don't get these scandals. And that is, as I see it, what whistleblowing is. And that's what I want to talk about today mostly is whistleblowing as something that happens in a company where the employer takes steps and implements measures to make sure that its employees has the freedom and the possibility to provide them with the information the management needs and the company needs to be able to avoid these kinds of actions that lead to scandal. So whistleblowing can cover a wide range of areas. Of course, it's about blowing the whistle, is about informing about something that is as it should not be. So it can be breach with law. If an employee sees that there is breach with law in a company, that is something that the employer definitely wants to hear about, because management in a company can't see everything that's going on, and they completely depend on their employees to be able to give that kind of information. And it can be big things like fraud and corruption, it can be mismanagement of employees, it can be breach with competition law, it can be breach with HSE laws, it can be harassment like the Me Too process has shown, it can be money laundering, it can also be smaller things like theft and so on. So that's one of the areas that is typically covered by whistleblowing. Next is the company's breach with its own policies, because most companies and most companies' management, of course, want to behave ethically and want to have the right way of doing things and implement policies to ensure that. But sometimes things don't go well. Sometimes the policies aren't adhered to for different reasons. It doesn't have to be someone doing something wrong per se. It's just that things don't necessarily work out as planned. And for that too, employers are absolutely dependent on their employees to raise their hands and tell them about things that aren't working. And that can be anything from simple things like alcohol abuse in the company, which obviously is in breach with most companies' policies, but it can also be neglecting safety policies, which can be really serious. It can be neglecting contractual commitment to customers, which really can put a company at risk. It can be breach with internal control procedures that takes place regularly, and so on. And those are things that employers want to know. And finally, there's the breach with moral principles, which this is obviously the most difficult area, because individuals have different views on what moral is. But in a whistleblowing sense, when we talk about moral principles, we talk about the typical moral principles that exist in the area that we're talking about. So it might typically, again, be alcohol and drugs, even if there isn't a policy on alcohol and drugs. If someone uses drugs in the workplace, in most workplaces, it would be a breach with moral principles. Also, discrimination. Very many companies have clear policies against it, but if they don't, it's a clear basic moral principle that you don't discriminate against your colleagues. So that's also a whistleblowing area. It can also be harassment. The Me Too example is a good example here, because even companies who don't have specific regulations against it, it will always be against moral principles to take advantage sexually or otherwise of subordinates and so on. So those are the three areas that I would think is covered by whistleblowing. And then often the issue comes up as well, what is not covered, because people in a company can be frustrated about things that affect their daily work, but that shouldn't really be covered by whistleblowing. So any daily business issues should, of course, be reported in the line structure to your manager. It's not about whistleblowing as such. Also, when it comes to personal conflicts in the work area and your own moral views. All people have different morals, and that's not something to really market in the workplace. It should be a common ground. So there are, of course, always some gray areas where it's difficult to see what is the day-to-day business and what is whistleblowing. Of course, I think it would be safe to say that it's better to open up to more whistleblowing than to push some away. But there are definitely areas that shouldn't be part of the whistleblowing as well.
Thank you, Sara. Very interesting and a great way to break down the types of whistleblowing one might encounter in a business. I don't think we often think about whistleblowing in such broad terms because of the high-profile cases we see in the media. But it really does encompass a lot of different areas, from drug and alcohol abuse to fraud, and all of which are important for companies to address. As we continue to see these situations coming up in the media, there does seem to be a change in some organizations. Some organizations are really taking in what is going on in society and societal demands of them. Starbucks, for example, initiated nationwide training on racial bias, diversity, and inclusion for all their stores in the United States. And for Starbucks, they're actually closing all locations to hold the training day. So in that context, Sara, should businesses address whistleblowers, and why?
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually, because, as you say, the concept of whistleblowing has become much more a public thing and the media thing the last, say, decade than it was before. And of course, that should encourage companies to take actions and to implement measures to make sure that the issues are managed internally before they go into the media. So that the way of kind of closing all stores to take care of an issue that has been seen internally is a very strong statement to say that this is not acceptable in our company. So that's a very good effect of what can happen if you have whistleblowing, and it's a very good way of demonstrating clearly that this is not something that is condoned by the company. So definitely we absolutely see that the society is changing and that whistleblowing is becoming more and more a public thing. And exactly for that reason, it gets even more important for the companies to make sure that they make it easy for whistleblowers to go internally first. It's a very simple principle. The wider your view is, the more you see. And any person or any group, like management in a company, can only see so many angles and have so many insights. When you actually can benefit from the insights and the angles from your whole company, then you have so much better chance of actually seeing these issues before they go global. Because it's not just because of the company. Of course, the company wants to find this first to avoid these scandals, but for the public society as well. If all companies make sure that they have the systems in place to avoid these scandals, then we wouldn't have the Cambridge Analyticas and the Me Too scandals that we have seen. But I think there's some way to go there to get all companies there. But we have definitely started taking the first steps on a global level, because I would say this is a global thing that covers everyone.
Definitely. Could you break it down into a few key benefits or reasons a company should address this? Like, if I were a compliance manager and I really wanted to bring this to my executive team and say, this is something we need to address, what are the top few reasons organizations need to look at whistleblowing in a more proactive and more structured manner?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because of course there are so many good things you want to do in a company, and you need to have the actual you need to have the reasons in place in order for it to make sense. And of course, I think there are really good reasons to encourage whistleblowing in a company. First of all, it's about getting control. It's about management having control, to put it simply, because if you don't have a good corporate governance and risk management, it's difficult to do good business. If you don't know what kind of strange stuff is going on in your organization, it's very difficult to implement anything you want to do. It's difficult to streamline the processes that make you money and so on. Of course, the control element also lowers your risk of legal processes, which takes a lot of time in a company whenever it happens. And if you have something in place and you do get a legal process starting, then you will have better leverage. You will have the processes in place as a company, so you're not kind of taken by surprise and have to initiate all kinds of processes that you don't have from before. And of course, you lower the risk of public laundry, as we have talked about a few times. So the control element is the first element. The second element that I would think is extremely important to most companies is trust. It's trust among your potential employees. It's trust among your potential customers. It's trust among your investors, your suppliers, and of course the public. If you have these processes in place and demonstrate clearly that you do have the interest to listen to your employees and actually get into the open what kind of issues you might have in the company, that does generate trust. So that would definitely be an important area, both specifically when it comes to customers, investors, and recruitment, I would say. So the third element, I would say, is to lower risk. Again, we have the legal processes. You lower the risk of falling into legal processes and the public laundry. And of course, your customers and your staff and the public, they have higher protection from issues happening. So you will be a company that gives lower risk to the people that you work with. This, of course, relates closely to the control area. That's why you see some of the same areas, because if you can actually lower your risk, you will be in control of your company. And finally, and I would like to underline that, even if I've mentioned it in the previous areas, it's prevention of loss. Because of course, if you have the risk control in place, you will be able to improve performance. You will be able to streamline your company, and you will avoid the malpractice and the wrongdoing. So your performance can and may improve. You will also reduce financial loss, obviously, because of court cases that you do not have. And finally, I would think that increase of staff morale is important as well. When the staff feel that they do have the open option to bring any issue to the management if needed, it's an important boost of morale and an important way of demonstrating that everyone has a say and that everyone is important in the company. So I would say those four areas are the important ones. It's the control, it's the trust, it's the lowered risk, and it's the prevention of loss.
Excellent. Thank you, Sara. Those are great categories, and they really capture the nuances and concerns around whistleblowing from both an employer and an employee perspective. So, going from why we should address whistleblowing, what are some steps that companies can take to start that process and have best practices in place? You mentioned that whistleblowing has changed quite a lot over the last decade or so. So what would you recommend as best practices for companies that want to take a more proactive approach to their whistleblowers and whistleblowing, and an approach that really sets them up for success?
Yeah, no, that's of course the important question. If you don't know how to do it, then it's difficult to go ahead. We have to mention to start with that there are some differences between countries. So I think about the whistleblowing elements in 4 steps. The first step that is completely and absolutely required for any organization to have whistleblowing in place, it is protection. Because if an employee cannot be protected from sanctions, if he or she comes forward with his or her issue, then of course the company is at risk of not getting much out of it, because the employees basically just won't dare to come forward. We do have examples in history about employees who have done anyway, but that requires an employee who is willing to risk his or her career basically to come forward, and you cannot be guaranteed of that. So if you as an employer want to make sure that you actually get some input and can rely on your employees to give you input, then you need to give them protection. So, but protection is partly from the law in the country where you operate. And that's of course something that you just cannot affect as a company. So you have, like in the US or in the UK or in the Nordics, you have laws that protect the whistleblower, so that the companies will not have any right to go to sanctions if issues are taken forward. But that's not the case in all countries. And when you're in a country where that's the case, then it's important to implement your own rules. So having your own code of conduct and your own whistleblowing policy that actually gives protection to your employees is of huge importance. If you don't do that, you will risk not getting any input at all. So I would say that's the kind of baseline. The next step, I would say, is incentives. By incentives, I mean that there is something that should encourage, not just protect the whistleblower if he or she comes forward, but is an incentive that might drive a whistleblower to come forward, even if he or she is reluctant to do so to start with. So incentives, they can be law, like in the US. For some types of whistleblowing, there are incentives, payments basically, to individuals. In the company policy, again, it's always possible to have some sort of either monetary reward, but also to give incentives where you raise an employee and make someone visible if they have raised an issue. I mean, visible in a positive way. So these are things that you can do in different ways in the company, but the important thing is that there needs to be a positive drive to blow the whistle. What that is can vary, of course, from market to market, really. And the third step, I think, is that it has to be possible to blow the whistle. And by that, I mean that there needs to be a system in place, or a structure, or the person who wants to blow the whistle needs to know who to call or send an email to or notify in a system. There needs to be some way of doing it. If you're in a large company, this can be difficult. In small companies, it's perhaps easier, but there might be people who know that there is something to report, who feel safe and who have incentives. They just have no idea how to actually go forward. And this too can be covered by law. Like in Norway, for instance, it is a legal requirement for a company to have a system in place to blow the whistle for employees. That's not the case everywhere, but of course, any company can create a whistleblowing policy outlining to all employees how this should be done. Of course, this can also be supported by systems, by software, making it even easier so that the employees can simply click a button or log into software and report what kind of issues they might have. So the important thing here is that it has to be possible, that the employee has to know what he or she is to do in practical terms to actually report the issue. Again, this is something that if it's not in place, you run the risk of not getting all the issues reported. So finally, the fourth step on the ladder, I would say, is to make blowing the whistle easy and safe. By easy, I mean that the process that you have in place should be extremely easy and time efficient to use. It basically boils down to software. If you don't have an easy to use system in place, there is always a hassle involved. So if you want to be completely sure that you get everything, then you should have an easy system. The safety also comes in here, and that points back to the first section of protection. Because by safe, I mean that each employee must feel, not just through a policy or a law, but also when it comes to the actual day-to-day felt safety, that they can come forward without getting any looks or without anyone talking behind their backs about them coming forward. And there is really just one solution to that, as I see it, and that is to provide the possibility to give anonymous reports. So, because of course, if you're in a country where whistleblowers are not necessarily protected, as long as you provide a way of giving anonymous reports, that will not affect the employee in question, and it will be a lot easier for employees to come forward. That can be many reasons why employees want to be anonymous. It can be things that are really not not based on the sanction fear of getting laid off, but the fear of just your manager knowing that you have something, that you know something that you possibly he or she doesn't know that you know. You don't want your colleagues to be aware that you have raised a hand. I would say that the possibility of remaining anonymous is extremely important. So if you want to be sure as an employer that you get the information that is there among your employees and that you need in order to reduce your risk and remain in control, and all these elements that we've seen in the previous slide, then these 4 steps should be what you would aim for.
Really great information, Sara. For companies that are looking to address where they're at today and embrace some of these best practices, can you give us more information on what they need to do or consider to move forward?
About best practices on how to go forward. So I have set up some basic elements that I would say should be part of any whistleblowing policy. Of course, how it should be worded and how it should be marketed, to put it that way, internally will vary. But I would say that a whistleblowing policy should be in place in any company, and it needs to describe the company's commitment to it, meaning that it cannot just be a leaflet from the HR department, but it has to represent the actual management's commitment to living by this policy. It should also define the scope and purpose. It's a very good idea to define the specific issues that you in your company want to be raised, that you might have specific examples that are relevant in your company, or you might want to have very wide definition that boils back to what we talked about earlier about breach of law, breach of policies, morale. That can be the overreaching purpose, but it can also be more specific. The third thing I think should be in there is to encourage, and here we come to the encouragement and the incentives, encourage employees to report at an early stage, as early as possible, because if you have an issue in your company, you want to know about it as early as possible. If you even have a possibility to give some sort of incentive here, that is where it should be described. That's of course up to each company. You should describe the system for reporting, and this can be any sort of system. It can be a software system, it can be an email address, it can be a phone number. Again, I would like to point to the possibility to provide anonymous reports that I talked about the last time. If that's something that you want to provide in a system, this is where you present it. You also need to describe what is going to happen. And that's something that each person needs to know. What will happen when a report is received by the management representative or whoever is the recipient of the report? Who is going to see it? What is going to happen? How long time is it going to take? Is there going to be any feedback? That of course depends on how the report is provided. The recipients of the reports should be listed. The level of anonymity and confidentiality should be listed, as we saw in the choice of system. You should also describe the risk of disciplinary action or for false or malicious allegations, because it is the case that by having a system for whistleblowing, there is always a risk that someone will seize the opportunity to bring forward false allegations. So you should be clear that such allegations will be followed up. But of course, you need to assess very carefully so that you don't keep people away. The more important point is to describe the risk of action for retaliation against someone who makes a whistleblowing report in good faith. So if someone has made a report in good faith, it's very important to make sure that there is no sanction against him or her. So that's something that should be in there. And finally, the rights of the individuals who are reported against should be listed. This is also of importance, as of course you never know, even if the allegations are given in very good faith, there might be nothing in them, and there is no reason to start a criminal action against someone. The process has to be done in fairness also to any individuals who are reported against, if it is in fact individuals. So if we, as an example, look at a Me Too case, if a report is received against one employee who has allegedly harassed another employee, it's important to make sure that both sides are looked at, and that should be clear already in the policy. So for the implementations, that's the content of the policy. For the implementation of the policy, it's important to have a system for logging the reports, and that is of great importance to be able to go back. You never know as a company if something blows up at a later stage or if something becomes more important at a later stage than it seemed at the time. So you need to be able to have a log of the reports you have gotten in. Of course, if you have a software system, that is normally something that you would have there. You also need to set out a system for documenting the step in the process from you receive a report to the conclusion. If there is any investigation that happens, or if the report is shared with a number of people and so on, you need to set out that system so that it is actually followed out. You need to guide your managers on how to deal with the reports, because even with the most fabulous whistleblowing policy, it doesn't really make a difference if you have managers who are not trained and not familiar with it. The managers are the people who will often be reached out to, and so they need to know how to deal with the reports. You need to make sure that the confidentiality of the reports are taken care of. Again, if you use a system, that's something that will be taken care of automatically. You need to make sure that the investigation is carried out properly. You also need to make sure that cases, that is not always relevant, but in very many cases, the outcome of such cases should be communicated internally. Of course, you should not, unless the whistleblower agrees to, you should not name anyone. But going out into the company and stating that we have received a report upon this or that, and we have now followed these and these steps to fix the issue, that is something that builds trust, as we discussed previously, because it shows that you take reports seriously and actually act on them. Then you need to ensure compliance with privacy laws. We're going to say a few words about that later. And data flow, and monitor the use of the system. You have internal audits from time to time.
Awesome, Sara. The point about data privacy is really interesting, especially given it's been in the news in relation to Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. And the GDPR is right around the corner. Can you enlighten us more about what organizations need to do when they're addressing their whistleblowing policies, but also in light of data privacy around the GDPR and other data privacy regulations?
Certainly. This is also an area where it varies from country to country, since privacy laws aren't the same everywhere. So what I will go through now is what is required under the GDPR. As you say, it has been covered widely in news, and of course in every company in Europe at the moment. For pure US companies, these issues do not come into the assessment. But bottom line is that any personal data, that means any information that can be related to an individual, has to be processed in accordance with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And when a whistleblower provides a report, there will very often be personal data. Not always. If the whistleblower itself is completely anonymous and the report that is delivered is not related to any person but to a process, then there might not be any personal data and the personal data regulation doesn't have to be followed. But in most cases, a report will either name the whistleblower or it will name someone else. A whistleblowing report will very often point to a person, not necessarily a named person, but a role or someone who has done something. And that will constitute personal data. It might even constitute sensitive personal data, or at least personal data that the person does not want to spread around. It's not positive things normally. So the requirements in the GDPR need to be taken into account before the system is set out. That means that as the employer, you will then be the controller if you're an employer here. You need to define the legal basis for processing data. Defining the legal basis should be fairly easy because in a whistleblowing setting, the legal basis will in most cases be what is called legitimate interest under the GDPR. It means that you as an employer have a legitimate interest to collect reports about issues that you need to avoid your own breach with law, your own breach with policies and so on. But of course, you need to make that assessment yourself and assess if it works for you. You also have to define the purpose for processing this personal data, and you need to make sure that you have proper technical and organizational measures in place for the processing. Technical and organizational measures refer to policies about how it's processed from a personal point of view, but also how it's technically processed when it comes to the information security that is used. For instance, by using email, you may have issues documenting that you have the proper technical and organizational measures in place, because email is rarely encrypted if you want to keep it open to everyone, and it's not that easy to follow the security. If you use a secure system, that is a lot easier to document. And then finally, you need to have documentation of your processes, as we also looked at under the whistleblowing policy, but you need to document the privacy areas. And finally, if you use a system to provide the service to you, typically a software, or if you use a third-party recipient to receive the reports, then you in fact have a processor as defined in the GDPR. So you need to have a data processing agreement with that processor to make sure that the processor follows the same regulations as you self do. If you have these things in place, then you can go ahead and collect reports for whistleblowing in accordance with the GDPR.
Great, thank you, Sara. Shifting the focus a little bit, Deloitte recently released their Global Human Capital Trends Report. In there, as well as various other reports, there are a lot of conversations around digital transformation, the future of work, AI, machine learning, to name a few. What do you think the future holds for whistleblowers in light of these advances?
It's a good question. I think that we are already on a journey where the role of the whistleblower has grown, and I think that it is going to grow forward even further. We're probably going to see more of these cases before we reach kind of the ideal situation. I think that it is going to be, in light of the scandals that we have seen, it is going to be easier to be whistleblower in each company, because it is going to be more and more obvious to companies that they need to have whistleblowing systems in place in order to avoid these scandals, in order to identify the issues they have in their organizations at an early stage so that they avoid these huge issues. That's of course first today for the really big companies who know that they will reach headlines if they don't provide this kind of systems. But of course, any company down to the smallest company has nothing else than benefit really from opening up to whistleblowing. Whistleblowing it's not huge processes. We've looked at many steps here, but these aren't huge, complicated processes. in its simplest form, it's just about being open to receiving and processing the input from your employees and actually taking them seriously. And I think that's going to grow as we go forward.
Definitely agree, and that's a great point. Aligned to that, what do companies need to consider when addressing whistleblowing today? In light of where organizations and society are going, what should businesses consider for the long term?
I think I'd like to go back to step number 4 that we talked about previously, about when companies implement. I think providing access to anonymous reporting should be something that every company should look into. Providing access to anonymous reporting gives the security for employees so that they can actually come forward with their concerns. I see it in my work also that kind of solution is something that opens up and gives much more insight into what employees know in the business than you would be able to get without that solution.
Well, I think that works as an excellent ending note. We're almost out of time today, and I definitely wanted to leave some time for questions and answers. Sara, thank you so much for all the information you've already given us and your clear expertise on this important topic. I think it was really valuable, not only understanding why organizations need to address whistleblowing, but how they can do that with some very practical, real steps that they can take to get from where they are today to have that open dialogue and build that trust that you pointed out throughout the interview. It's a really important topic, and with the societal shifts in business and relationships, we'll see how it plays out in the next few years. But switching over to Q&A for the last few minutes of our webinar, we have quite a few questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can, and any we don't get to, we'll follow up after the webinar in an email. Just a reminder, you can submit your questions in the Q&A tool in your GoToWebinar console. So, question number 1. What group or department should own whistleblowing? Is it HR?
That's a very good question. I think that HR in most companies will be the right place to manage the system as such. But when it comes to ownership, I feel very strongly that it has to be management, because the whole concept of whistleblowing is giving the insight to management that management needs in order to address issues that are going on in the company. So the ownership has to be with management, but of course the day-to-day handling of it can be in the HR department or in the compliance department or in the legal department. That varies a bit from company to company. The most important thing is that management owns it.
Great question. For question 2, we are trying to roll out a global whistleblowing solution, but are having challenges in drawing the lines between what is and is not whistleblowing. Can you give us insight on how to manage that balance?
That's a good question. That's one of the questions that's impossible to give a clear and certain answer to, because of course you don't want to be so strict on it that you scare people from coming forward. But I think it's important to describe in your policy that day-to-day business issues are something that should be raised to your manager through your ordinary line structure. So if you're unhappy with something that happens in your department, if you're unhappy with the way you're placed in your office or things like that, it should in most cases be taken through the line structure, unless you're told to lay off. Also, I think it's important to underline that personal conflicts are not something that should be taken to a whistleblowing solution. It needs to be taken through the real line or the line reporting structure.
Really interesting. I imagine a common challenge for businesses. Okay, for question number 3, we are currently exploring whether our whistleblower procedures are enough. What would you recommend as the first step in analyzing our current setup, and what needs to happen next?
Yeah, if you have a system and not quite sure how good it is, I would start with an internal audit. Simply, it doesn't have to be a big system, but of course you need to look at what kind of reports have come in. if you don't have a log of reports, and if you don't really have a system where you can see what has happened to reports that have come in, I would say that you should start over, because one of the important things is to make sure that you as management have the overview of what has come in. So if you don't have that in place, I would discard the system that you have and start all over with a new whistleblowing policy, going through the one you have, and make sure that it includes the content that you want, and that it is worded in such a way that you see that your employees actually will come forward with their issues.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. This one is interesting from an employee point of view. The question says, as an employee in Germany, I know myself and my colleagues are concerned about retaliation and repercussions or protection. How should a global enterprise manage the differences in legal requirements while handling employee retaliation concerns?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's interesting that it comes from Germany, because many countries have express laws. In Germany, there is no express law on whistleblowing. It's covered by the employment law as such, so that there is no clear protection against retaliation. So of course, from an employer point of view, from an employee point of view, that means that you will really want an anonymous solution in order to come forward with your issue. Particularly if this is an issue against an individual or an issue against a manager, where you see that there might be conflict. So I would say, both from an employer point of view and from an employee point of view, in the countries where there's no express law, so that there is no clear security or clear safety for each individual, an anonymous solution makes great sense, so that you as an employer can make sure that you get the feedback, the input you need, and then as an employee that you're free to give it.
Excellent. Well, we're just about out of time for today. Thank you again, Sara, for joining us, and all of our attendees that are listening in. That wraps up the first webinar in our webinar series, Love Your Whistleblowers. The next webinar will cover data privacy and the GDPR, followed by creating a culture of safety from within. To register for the next webinars, please visit our webinar section at questback.com. For any remaining questions, we'll get back to you via email, and of course, Sara is also available for longer chats if anyone's interested. The link to the recording will be sent out shortly after we're done today. Thank you so much, Sara, and thank you everyone for joining us.